You hear the silk first, the whisper of fabric against lacquered floors, the rustle of robes moving in perfect synchronization. Your wrists ache where the ceremonial bracelets bite into skin. Through the carved sandalwood screen, you can see shadows lengthening across the courtyard, elongating into the shapes of dragons and phoenixes that seem to watch your every breath. Someone is crying 3 chambers away, the sound muffled by walls thick enough to swallow screams. You've been here 6 days, or perhaps 6 weeks' time, dissolves differently within these vermilion walls, where clocks measure not hours but hierarchies, not minutes, but the emperor's moods. Your feet throb in their bindings, the cloth wrapped so tightly that your toes have begun to curl under like petals closing at dusk. You try to remember your mother's face, but the memory is already fading, replaced by the face of the woman who examined you yesterday. Her fingers cold and clinical, as they checked your teeth like you were livestock at market. If you're curious about these hidden chapters of history, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze me that stories varied for centuries can suddenly connect us across every continent and time zone. The year is 1735, and behind the towering walls of Beijing's Forbidden City, an empire within an empire operates according to rules the outside world will never fully comprehend. This is the inner court of the Qing dynasty, where as many as 20,000 women live in a labyrinth of courtyards and corridors that most of them will never leave alive. They weren't criminals. They were selected, the word itself a euphemism that conceals the machinery of systematic abduction that operated across China for more than 2 millennia. Every 3 years, officials fanned out across the empire with imperial mandates, searching for girls between 13 and 16 whose faces and bodies met specifications recorded in bureaucratic ledgers. Beauty mattered less than bloodline, virtue less than fertility potential. But once chosen, these girls vanished into the palace like stones dropped into deep water, their disappearance marked only by the ripples of grief they left in families who would never see them again. The architecture of the Forbidden City was designed not for grandeur, though it achieved that incidentally, but for containment. The inner court was a prison disguised as paradise, its red walls and golden roofs concealing a world where women were categorized, ranked, and catalogued with the same meticulous attention officials gave to tax revenues and grain stores. At the top stood the empress, theoretically the most powerful woman in China, though even she existed only in relation to the emperor's authority. Below, her descended ranks upon ranks of consorts, concubines, noble ladies, and attendants, each title precisely calibrated to indicate distance from imperial favor. A woman could spend her entire life, 30, 40, 50 years trapped in this hierarchy, rising or falling based on factors entirely outside her control, the emperor's whim, a rival's scheme, the gender of a child she might bear. But the true architects of control in the inner court weren't the women, or even the emperor. They were the eunuchs men, whose bodies had been mutilated to render them supposedly safe guardians of imperial women. During the Ming dynasty alone, over 100,000 eunuchs served in the palace, their numbers a testament to the scale of surveillance required to maintain this system. These weren't volunteers, most were boys between 8 and 12, taken from impoverished families who sold their sons for the promise of palace positions. The castration procedure in China wasn't partial, it was total. Both penis and testicles were removed with a single curved blade, leaving only a small opening maintained by inserting a metal or wooden plug during the healing process. The survival rate hovered around 60%. Those who lived faced lifelong incontinence, chronic pain, and social ostracism. Their mutilated bodies a permanent reminder of what the system demanded for access to power. Imagine being one of those boys in the moments before the procedure. You're 10 years old, held down by men whose faces you can't see through your tears. You don't fully understand what's about to happen, only that your parents said this would give your family security, that you would live in the palace and eat fine food and wear silk robes. The pain, when it comes, is beyond anything your child's mind has language for. Then comes infection, fever, delirium days, or weeks when you hover between life and death, while your body either accepts or rejects this violence. If you survive, you wake into a life where you belong nowhere. Fit into no category your culture recognizes, useful only as an instrument of surveillance over people whose bodies were kept intact. The daily reality for women in the inner court was one of bureaucratized intimacy. Every aspect of their lives was recorded, monitored, calculated. Imperial secretaries maintained meticulous records of the emperor's sexual encounters, noting dates, duration, and which consort had been summoned, all recorded in vermilion ink as if these most private moments were affairs of state, which, in a sense, they were. A consort's value was measured entirely by her ability to produce male heirs, and the machinery of the palace existed to optimize this production while preventing any possibility that an heir might not be the emperor's biological child. Before being admitted to the imperial bedchamber, women underwent medical examinations to verify they were in the appropriate phase of their menstrual cycle for conception. Doctors checked for signs of disease or abnormality. Attendants supervised ritual baths that were less about cleanliness than control. For many women, the cruelest paradox of the system was that being ignored by the emperor offered no escape from its torments. If you were never summoned to the imperial bed, you still couldn't leave. You still lived under constant surveillance, your movements restricted, your communications monitored, your future determined by the decisions of people you might never meet. Some women spent 50 years in the Forbidden City without ever speaking to the emperor. They grew old waiting for a summons that never came, their youth and beauty fading behind walls that had become their entire universe. When they died, they were buried in unmarked graves outside the city, their names forgotten, their lives reduced to a single notation in a ledger. Deceased, rank for consort, no issue. But being chosen by the emperor brought its own horrors, because attention in the palace was never benign. During the reign of Emperor Jiujing, who ruled from 1521 to 1567, the machinery of the Imperial Harem evolved into something approaching systematic industrial horror. Jiujing became obsessed with Taoist alchemy and the pursuit of immortality, and his alchemists convinced him that the key to eternal life lay in a substance called red lead, a concoction made from the menstrual blood of virgin girls. To produce this substance, the emperor ordered that hundreds of girls aged 13 and 14 be brought to the palace and subjected to a specialized regimen. They were fed only mulberry leaves and rainwater, kept in isolated chambers, and their menstrual blood harvested each month by eunuchs and court physicians. Picture one of these girls during the collection process. She's 14, has been in the palace for 8 months, hasn't seen sunlight in weeks because the alchemists believe darkness improves blood purity. Her diet of leaves and rainwater has left her weak, her body struggling through puberty without adequate nutrition. Each month, when her cycle begins, attendants arrive with collection vessels and instruments. They treat her body like a factory, her blood like a product being harvested for quality control. She watches other girls around her growing weaker, some collapsing from malnutrition, others developing infections that the court physicians treat with herbs and prayers. Girls who become too sick to produce blood are beaten and discarded, thrown out of the palace to die in the streets, or sold to brothels if they're strong enough to be considered valuable. The horror escalated as Jiujing's obsession deepened. When he decided the blood of 13 and 14-year-olds wasn't potent enough, he lowered the age requirement. In 1552, he ordered the collection of 200 girls aged 8 to 10. 3 years later, he brought in 150 more girls under 8 years old. These were children, some so young they hadn't begun puberty, their bodies monitored by physicians, who were essentially waiting for them to become useful for blood harvest. The palace became a warehouse of child prisoners, their small bodies commodified in the service of an emperor's delusional quest for immortality. All while the empire he neglected crumbled at its borders. The women in Jiujing's harem reached their breaking point on the night of November 27, 1542, in an incident known to history as the Renian Plot. 16 palace women, ranging in age from 14 to 21, made a decision that night to attempt something that had never succeeded in the 2,000-year history of the Chinese imperial system. They would assassinate the emperor. They waited until Jiujing fell asleep in the chambers of his favorite consort, Lady Cao. After she withdrew with her primary attendants, the 16 women entered the bedchamber and surrounded the sleeping emperor. One woman had brought a ribbon from her harem, a delicate piece of silk given to her by her mother the day she was taken from her village. She tried to strangle him with it first, the ribbon cutting into his throat. But silk designed for beauty lacked the tensile strength for murder. When that failed, they grabbed a cord from the bed curtains and wrapped it around the emperor's neck. But these were women trained in music, poetry, and the elaborate rituals of palace etiquette, not the mechanics of efficient killing. They tied the wrong knot, one that tightened under pressure but could still be loosened, and in their panic and inexperience, they couldn't hold the emperor still long enough to finish what they'd started. He began to struggle, thrashing against their hands. Some of the women froze, others pulled harder, their hands shaking. The entire attempt took less than 2 minutes, 120 seconds, during which these women gambled everything they had, which was already nothing, for a chance at stopping the systematic horror of Jiujing's reign. One woman panicked and fled to alert Empress Fang. By dawn, the emperor had regained consciousness, and the machinery of imperial justice was already moving, cold and unstoppable, toward the predetermined fate of the 16 women who had tried to kill him. Empress Fang, acting with the ruthless efficiency required of those who held power in the Ming court, ordered all 16 executed by Linky death by 1,000 cuts, among the most prolonged and agonizing punishments ever devised. Trained executioners would make thousands of tiny incisions over several days, calibrated to keep victims conscious and suffering, slicing flesh without severing major blood vessels until the intended end. Picture the scene as the women were dragged to the execution ground. The youngest, only 15, had been in the palace for 18 months and barely understood the full scope of what she had lost. The oldest, at 22, had watched friends disappear into Jiujing's blood-harvesting chambers, had seen girls younger than her sister turned into walking reservoirs for the emperor's immortality delusions. Stripped and bound to wooden frames, they were displayed for a crowd gathered not only to witness punishment, but to absorb a warning. The executioners began with cuts on fingers, toes, ears, small wounds to maximize agony while minimizing early blood loss. Some of the women screamed, others muttered prayers or poetry. One cried out for her mother until her voice broke. Cruelty extended beyond the condemned. Empress Fang ordered 10 family members of the conspirators beheaded and 20 more sold into slavery. Parents who had already lost daughters to the imperial selection process now lost their own lives for their children's desperation. Siblings who had done nothing but share blood were sold like livestock, their futures erased. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be punished collectively, genealogically, extinguishing not just individuals but their family lines. What makes the Renayan plot devastating is not simply its brutal punishment, but the conditions that drove 16 women to choose certain torture over a continued life within the palace. These were not impulsive girls acting on a whim. They planned their rebellion for weeks inside a surveillance state, where conversations were monitored and walls quite literally had ears. They knew the consequences of failure because they had seen women die for far less, and still they acted for them. Death by 1,000 cuts was preferable to one more day, producing blood for an emperor who believed their bodies could make him immortal. The emperor's response showed how thoroughly the system insulated its architects. He tightened restrictions on surviving blood-producing girls and, after Empress Fang's death in 1547, summoned 300 new ones to replace those who had died, been executed, or grown too weak. The assassination attempt changed nothing. It simply removed 16 women who had imagined resistance and replaced them with fresh victims. Yet the darkness of the Imperial Harem was not confined to the Ming dynasty. Its logic reducing women to biological or political resources persisted across centuries. Fast forward to 1900, during the reign of the Guangxu Emperor, and we find consort Zun, whose fate reveals how the palace reinvented its cruelties while preserving its core structure. Zun entered the Forbidden City at 13 with her elder sister, both selected as concubines in a hierarchy hardly changed since Ming times. But Zun possessed something dangerous, curiosity, and a spirit that refused complete submission, while other consorts devoted themselves to embroidery or classical poetry. Zun read foreign newspapers, asked questions about Western science, and discussed political reforms with anyone who would listen. She also captured the genuine affection of Emperor Guangxu, who saw in her a partner in his desire to modernize China. This made her a direct threat to the power of Empress Dowager Cixi, the most formidable woman in China. Cixi herself had entered the palace as a vulnerable concubine, survived by producing the emperor's only male heir, and transformed that accident of biology into nearly half a century of political dominance. She understood the palace's logic perfectly. Survival required ruthlessness greater than that of one's oppressors. When she saw Guangxu's affection for Zun as a danger, she acted in 1894, citing intervention in political affairs. Cixi stripped Zun of rank and, according to multiple accounts, had her flogged by eunuchs, a punishment meant to humiliate as much as to injure. Imagine being 24, stripped naked before court officials, beaten for the crime of intelligent conversation with your husband. The flogging was a message. Curiosity, intelligence, and genuine affection were threats in a palace that valued obedience above all else. Zhen's final chapter unfolded during the chaos of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. As foreign armies closed in on Beijing, the imperial court prepared to flee. Cixi summoned Zun from house arrest. With false concern masking cruelty, she told Zun, "You are young and pretty and likely to be violated by foreign soldiers. Do you know what you should do?" It was a command to commit suicide, framed as mercy. Zun refused. Instead, she begged that Emperor Guangxu remain in Beijing to negotiate a final act of loyalty and political clarity. Her refusal shattered the thin veneer of Cixi's pretense. Enraged, Cixi ordered eunuchs to seize Zun and throw her into a narrow well behind Ning'er Palace. Picture the moment. Zun, 24, dragged across a courtyard toward a stone shaft barely 2 feet wide. She screamed for Guangxu, who was held captive and powerless. The well's walls were slick with moss. Forced in headfirst, her body scraped stone as she fell 30 feet into stagnant darkness. The impact broke bones. The water drowned her. She died alone in the same palace that had consumed thousands before her. Her body lay in the well for more than a year. When it was recovered in 1901, her remains were almost unrecognizable. Today, the well still stands, covered with a stone slab, visited by tourists who rarely grasp that they are looking at a murder site. Cixi, once a victim of the harem system, had become its consummate enforcer. This is how systems of oppression endure, not through eternal villains, but through the transformation of survivors into architects of further cruelty. The Imperial Harem collapsed with the Qing dynasty in 1912, yet its echoes lingered. Concubines who outlived the empire continued living inside the Forbidden City, maintaining their hierarchy even after the structure that created it was gone. The logic of the system outlived the system itself. Walk through the Forbidden City today and you see restored walls and golden roofs, but not the 20,000 women who lived and died behind them, blood-harvested, silenced, forgotten. The architecture survives. Their memories were never preserved with the same care. Yet the 16 women who tried to kill Jing and consort Zun who refused suicide left something the empire could not erase, a record of resistance. They could not escape in life, but their defiance survives. Stand by Zhen's well after the crowds pass, and the silence seems to hold her final refusal to obey. The empire is gone, Cixi is dust, but the well remains, a stone throat remembering what it swallowed, waiting for those willing to hear what it says about power, beauty, and the cost women paid for men's dreams of immortality.